When we eat meat, dairy, eggs, seafood, our gut flora can take certain components in them, carnitine and choline, and produce something that ends up as a toxic compound called TMAO, which may set us up for a heart attack, stroke, and death. So give people 2 eggs, and you get a spike of TMAO in your bloodstream within hours of consumption. Because gut bacteria play a critical role in this process, though, if you then give them a week of antibiotics to wipe out their gut flora and refeed them 2 more eggs, nothing happens. No TMAO in their bloodstream because they have no egg-eating bacteria to make it. But give it a month for their gut bacteria to start to grow back, and the eggs start to cause TMAO production once again. Same thing with meat. Give people the equivalent of an 11-ounce steak, and TMAO levels shoot up in the blood, but feed them the same amount after a week of antibiotics, and nothing happens. So to run into problems, you need both the meat and the meat-eating bugs. That's why you can feed a vegan a sirloin, and they don't produce TMAO within their body. They just don't have the meat-eating bugs in their gut. OK, now this should all be old news for those who've been following the science. The reason for this video is to show that this phenomenon happens the other way around too. When we eat whole plant foods like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and beans, along with nuts and seeds, our gut flora can take certain components in them, fiber and resistant starch, and produce short-chain fatty acids, which can set us up for the prevention of human diseases. Short-chain fatty acids like butyrate can help seal up a leaky gut, fight inflammation, prevent weight gain, improve insulin sensitivity, accelerate weight loss, and fight cancer. But these benefits rely on 2 things, eating fiber and having fiber-feeding bugs, just like the detrimental effects from TMAO required not only eggs, dairy, or meat, but also the eggs, dairy, or meat-munching bugs. Check this out. If you give people whole intact grains, in this case barley kernels, also known as barley groats, 3 servings a day, like I recommend in my Daily Dozen app, within just 3 days of eating that extra 30+ grams of fiber and resistant starch, their gut bugs were so happy and produced so many short-chain fatty acids that people's insulin levels improved by 25%, which means their bodies needed to produce less insulin to take care of the same amount of white bread, while still dampening the blood sugar spike. But this was on average. Some people responded to all that extra fiber with beautiful dips in blood sugar and insulin responses, but in others, the same amount of fiber and resistant starch didn't work at all. Why? Because you don't just need fiber, but fiber-feeding bugs like Prevotella. How do you get more Prevotella so you can take full advantage of the health benefits of plants? Eat more plants. Prevotella abundance is associated with long-term fiber intake. If you look at rural African children eating 97% whole food plant-based diets, their Prevotella is off the charts compared to kids eating standard Western diets, and this is reflected in the amount of short-chain fatty acids they are churning out in their poop. In the industrialized world, it's those habitually eating vegetarian and vegan that promotes the enrichment of fiber-eating bacteria in the gut. Here's the relative Prevotella abundance between those who eat meat, no meat, or all plants. This may help explain the worse inflammatory profile in omnivores than in vegetarians. Based on the findings relative to bacteria abundance, the researchers suggest that exposure to animal foods may favor an intestinal environment which could trigger systemic inflammation and insulin resistance-dependent metabolic disorders such as type 2 diabetes. And it's the reduced levels of inflammation that may be the key factor linking a plant-based gut microbiota with protective health benefits. Yeah, but can't meat-eaters eat lots of plants too? Omnivores have constraints on diet-dependent gut microbiome metabolite production. In other words, it's the flip side of the vegan eating a steak. They can eat all the fiber they want, but may be lacking in fiber-munching machinery. At low levels of fiber intake, the more you eat, the more of the beneficial short-chain fatty acids are made, but at a certain point your available fiber feeders are maxed out. There's only so much you can benefit. But those habitually eating a plant-based diet have been cultivating the growth of these fiber feeders, and the sky's the limit. unless, of course, you're eating vegan junk. But whole food plant-based diets should be effective in promoting a diverse ecosystem of beneficial bacteria to support both our gut microbiome and our overall health.
What the heck are fermented foods? Well, fermentation actually refers to the fact that most lower life forms, like yeast and bacteria, have to make energy by a process called glycolysis. And we won't take you back to high school biology. But essentially, they take sugar molecules, which are a source of carbon, and through a process called glycolysis, they make ATP, the energy currency. Glycolysis is actually a very inefficient process for making ATP. And you and I don't use glycolysis. We use mitochondria and the electron transport chain. But glycolysis is basically fermentation. And fermentation takes sugar and turns it into energy for the bacteria or the fungus or the mold or the yeast. And what's left over is actually what are called postbiotics. And just to review, probiotics are friendly bacteria. Prebiotics are the foods that probiotics ferment. During the process of fermentation, you produce compounds that are called postbiotics. And if we had to do it all over again, we wouldn't use these names, but sorry about that, we're stuck with it. So vinegar, for instance, is a product of fermentation. For that matter, wine is a product of fermentation. For that matter, beer is a product of fermentation. And what's fascinating is almost all ancient cultures preserved their foods or made their foods edible via the process of fermentation. So fermentation of foods have been practiced actually for past recorded history. There's evidence that the Egyptians were fermenting foods 10,000 years ago, really around the beginning of agriculture. One of the reasons we think that fermentation happened was, number one, there was no storage system. There wasn't refrigeration. There was no way to actually keep food fresh. And in the process of just storing food, fermentation was a natural process that would start regardless of what you expected to do. What's interesting is many cultures actively used fermentation to make their food probably far more edible. And interestingly enough, as many of you know, fermentation in general breaks down lectins. Believe it or not, a lot of bacteria love to eat lectins. They think they are delicious, and they will eat the lectins, for instance, in quinoa. Fun fact, the Incas always fermented quinoa before they ate it. They let it rot, and then they cooked it. Now, unfortunately, that's not on the package directions. Immemorial, beans were always soaked for a considerable period of time. And most people, if they bother to look, notice that if you soak your beans, foam will appear on the top of the water. And that foam is actually the carbon dioxide produced by the native bacteria on beans fermenting the bean. And so traditionally, beans were diminished in their lectin content because they were soaked for a considerable period of time. And onward and onward. So not only does fermentation really reduce lectins, but fermentation gives you postbiotics. And it's the miracle of these postbiotics that I've mentioned in my last two books But now in Gut Check, which will be out in January, you really get to see how important these postbiotics that have occurred from fermentation really are. Among the main things that fermentation does, one of the main postbiotics is short-chain fatty acids. Now, many of you have heard me talk about butyrate, one of the most important short-chain fatty acids there is. And as you've heard about in my previous books, but you're going to see even more in Gut Check, butyrate is really the single most important short-chain fatty acid for your health that you can imagine. Now, we hopefully have bacteria that can make butyrate out of fiber, but it gets much more complicated than that. And let me give you a study that I've mentioned before, and I've mentioned it in Unlocking the Keto Code. A husband and wife team of researchers at Stanford, the Sonnenbergs, did a fantastic study with human volunteers that was published last year. We've known for a very long time that fiber is really good for you, right? And fiber is prebiotics. And we've known for a very long time that our gut bacteria really like prebiotic fiber. And the thought was that our gut bacteria can take prebiotic fiber and make all these wonderful postbiotics like butyrate. And if they do this, everything gets better and our immune system gets better, etc., etc. Not so fast, say the Sonnenbergs. So they took human volunteers. Half got a whole lot of soluble fiber. The other half got the same soluble fiber, but they were given fermented foods, primarily in the form of yogurt or kombucha or kefir. And then they watched what happened to their gut microbiome diversity. Diversity means lots of different species. And as you'll learn in Gut Check, the more diverse your microbiome, the more different members of that community, the better your health. And they looked at the immune system. They looked at inflammation markers. Lo and behold, what was shocking was the folks who got the fiber alone actually didn't improve their microbiome diversity, nor did it have much effect on the immune system, on inflammation. But the group that got the fiber with the fermented foods had much improved gut microbiome diversity, and the inflammatory markers went down. So what's up with that? Well, it turns out in my research, yes, you want bacteria to be able to make butyrate. But what's fascinating is many of the butyrate producing bacteria actually have to have precursors for butyrate to manufacture butyrate, basically assembly line. And so one of the shocking things is that they need, for the most part, other short chain fatty acids to do the conversion. So they need, like for instance, acetic acid or propionic acid, acetate or propionate, to make butyrate. And yeah, they need the fiber, but they gotta have the precursors to assemble all the parts to make butyrate. And that explains why it was only the group that got the fermented foods that had these short chain fatty acids, that then when they got the fiber, they can complete the manufacturing process. It's also amazing in my studies of the longest living cultures of the world that almost all of these cultures have fermented foods in their diet. And some of them might surprise you. So let's set the record straight on no-go fermented foods. Yogurt. Now, yogurt is a fermented food. The problem with American yogurt in general is that most of our cows make a protein called casein A1, which by itself can be a lectin-like compound, a very inflammatory compound. Now, cows in France and Italy, goats and sheep and water buffalo have casein A2. So what I want you to do is try to avoid American cow milk yogurt. There's plenty of goat yogurt available, there's sheep yogurt available, there's coconut yogurt available, there's even pili nut yogurt available called lava. All of these are great options. The other problem with most yogurts in America is they are loaded with sugar. So you've got to be a wise consumer and actually look for the amount of added sugar to the yogurts. So look for the unsweetened variety. And if you want them sweeter, just put some allulose in. And good news, allulose is a prebiotic sweetener that feeds good gut bacteria. Now the second non-starter is most kombucha. Now don't get me wrong, kombucha is a phenomenal fermented food that has great postbiotics. But kombucha is tangy, and Americans in general don't like tangy things. So companies put a whole lot of sugar in so many of the popular kombuchas to cover up that tanginess. So please read the label carefully. There are a number of popular kombuchas that have as much sugar as a soda, and that's not what you're looking for. Also remember that sugar isn't going to benefit your good bacteria at all, and it will only feed bad bacteria and yeast that you really don't want. On the other hand, there are some kombuchas that are low sugar, and they are available, but you gotta read the label and just be careful of the amount of added sugar in these products. Now, sourdough bread. Years ago, when the Plant Paradox came out, I was invited on the Dr. Oz show with one proviso. Dr. Oz, who's a friend of mine, said, "You're going to have to give me a bread that people can eat, otherwise I'm not having you on the show." True story. So I said, well, there is no safe bread, but if you're going to eat bread, then sourdough bread would be the safest because it is a fermented bread. We have to realize that almost all breads traditionally were raised, were given heft by the addition of yeast. And the yeast fermented the sugars and also the lectins in bread, and that produced a even loaf. The Egyptians are the first credited with doing this. On the other hand, almost all commercial breads in the United States no longer use yeast to make the bread rise. It's too inefficient and it's too unpredictable. That's why you get big holes and little holes. You want even holes, and that's not with yeast. So modern American bread doesn't use yeast to raise the bread. Now, traditionally, sourdough bread is made with a sourdough starter, which uses these yeast and bacteria. But most sourdough bread in the United States, it says sourdough because they use sourdough, but most of the bread was still unfermented. So buyer beware. Sourdough bread in the United States, for the most part, is not what you're looking for. Okay, so let's get to the good stuff, because there's some easy to use good stuff. Number one best fermented food that's easy to find and use is vinegar. You gotta give the assembly line to make butyrate what it needs, and vinegar supplies acetic acid, the short chain fatty acid that it needs. Now, if you want a deep dive about other videos all about the benefits of vinegar, go to my YouTube channel and check out vinegars. Now, acetic acid is also a communication system between our gut bacteria and our mitochondria. And acetic acid, as well as butyric acid, are one of the best ways to uncouple mitochondria. And once you uncouple your mitochondria, you get profoundly good health. Probiotics, even if they were in vinegar, are long dead. But those dead probiotics also carry information. So, for instance, apple cider vinegar with the mother. The mother is actually all the dead bacteria and what's left over of the polyphenols in apples. And those dead bacteria also carry information. And it's a really exciting information that you're going to learn about in Gut Check. Dead bacteria tell tales. Now, vinegar is a great way to do this. Vinegars make you actually uncouple your mitochondria to lose weight. And one of the miracles of weight loss with vinegars is this uncoupling effect. Now, I loved aged balsamic vinegar. It has multiple available polyphenols. It's actually the richest source of resveratrol that you can get. I happen to have a brand that I recommend. I have no relationship with them. They're called Napa Valley Naturals, and you want the Grand Reserve. It's really thick. And you just need a teaspoon or a tablespoon to make my famous fake Coke. You use sparkling water. I prefer San Pellegrino. I have no relationship with them. And you put in some balsamic vinegar, stir it around, and presto changeo, you have got a health-enhancing compound that tastes really good, and it tastes kind of like a fake Coke. Apple cider vinegar, champagne vinegar, red wine vinegar, sherry vinegar. Knock your socks off. I've got probably 8 different vinegars that we mix and match in our salads. And it's a really easy way to get these postbiotics that you need. Now, here's a shocker. My second best favorite way of getting these fermented postbiotics into you is raw cheese. Newsflash, raw cheese. What does raw cheese mean? Well, it turns out cheeses, particularly in Europe, do not require pasteurization to make it into the United States. The bacteria and the yeast in milk actually impart great postbiotics in the process of making cheese. And there's particularly some raw cheese bacteria that actually promote weight loss. And surprise, surprise, 3 of the blue zones that I've talked about before, and you'll learn more about in Gut Check, 3 of the blue zones eat large amounts of raw sheep and goat cheeses as part of their diet. Now, there's also an incredibly interesting component in whole milk, which is called milk fat globulin membrane. And these membranes surround milk fat, and they actually are one of the strongest mitochondrial uncouplers known to mankind. And it's in whole fat cheeses. Wow, so you get a double benefit. Now, here's number 3 that is going to shock you. And this is straight from long-lived people. Most people probably don't know that the longest life expectancy in the world by country is in Andorra. Now, Andorra is this little tiny country between Spain and France, up in the Pyrenees Mountains. And these guys are sheep herders, and they eat sausage every day. In fact, a nearby town in France, Toulouse, basically lives on sausage. And Toulouse, despite living on sausage, has the lowest degree of heart disease in all of France. despite having this massive high saturated fat diet. What gives? It turns out that traditionally sausages are cured, are aged by the addition of bacteria. And bacteria eat the sugar molecules in the meat. And they also, fun fact, eat new 5-GC, which is in beef, lamb, and pork, which, as many of you have read, is a real mischievous molecule that really harms our health. But fermentation of meat, of sausages, eliminates new 5-GC, and it also eliminates new 5-GC in milk products. So strange as it may be, traditional sausage making is a fermented food that has postbiotics, fermented things that improve your health. So if you want the world's life expectancy, eat fermented sausages. Now, not so fast. Most sausages in the United States are not fermented. You can't have a Jimmy Dean's breakfast sausage and get a benefit. Most sausages with an Italian name applied to them, like pepperoni and salami, are not fermented. So buyer beware. But you can find traditionally fermented sausages that are made in France or Portugal or Italy, and they are findable, and those are actually remarkably good for you. Who knew? So, vinegar, aged raw cheeses or aged cheeses from Europe in general, and traditionally prepared sausages. Eat your fermented foods and buyer beware which ones to avoid.